Like the theme of the constellations thing a bit, and then introduce the planets. Okay, so I think that we should make a start. I'd just like to welcome you all on behalf of IILAH and on behalf of its new research program, which James Barker over there is like the director of. It's called Law, Sound and the International. And also to the first in this new seminar series called Constellations. The focus on this series is on questions, specifically on questions of methodology, and on what we can learn, whichever discipline we might come from hearing about the methods and the theories of method that are being used by scholars and practitioners working in disciplines we don't know about. So in each seminar, in each Constellation seminar, there's going to be a panel and the people on the panel will share a common substantive theme. But they'll be working on this common theme in very different ways. So the idea is to try and create a conversation about what they're doing and why they're doing it that way. So today's seminar has the common theme of sound, thinking with sound. And we're very lucky to have a panel of 4 very interesting people whose practices and interests range from neuroscience to composition and from sonic violence to instrument making. So that's why the series is called Constellations. Obviously, I'm not the first person to steal this image from Walter Benjamin, but I kind of couldn't resist it because it was so apt, given that the point of the series was to get away from the idea of discipline and to try and locate the connections in the millions and millions of different research projects that are going on all over Melbourne University and elsewhere, and to try and see where there's potential for methodological overlap and sharing, because even though there is this potential, often we find that we're working in a kind of disciplinary isolation. So in using this image, Benjamin was trying to draw radical diachronic constellations between apparently unconnected events in the past and present. And what we're trying to do here is to draw radical synchronic connections between apparently unconnected scholarly projects and methods, but the objective is the same. It's to kind of get away from the linearity associated with discipline and methodology, so as to trigger what Benjamin called a flash of awakened consciousness, capable of lighting up the contours of some of the more difficult problems that are confronting us in scholarship in the arts and social sciences today. But this methodological cross-contamination is not just a question of doing more rigorous and more critical scholarship. It's also a highly political question concerned with the distribution and allocation of resources. So to use one example that James pointed out to me the other day while we were talking about it, the Australian government's decision, which I'm sure you all know about, to reallocate some $20 billion from frontline healthcare and education to a medical research future fund, has drawn criticism from the very medical researchers who stand to benefit from this. So Professor Ian Chubb, Australia's chief scientist, said he could not see a strategy in a budget which hiked up funding for medical research while cutting funding in all other areas of research. He said the government seemed to be disconnecting medical research from all the rest, but different kinds of research are linked. To do good medical research, you need good chemistry and good physics and good biology and good genetics. It doesn't make sense to separate one thing out. So even in the heart of the educational establishment, if we can call it that, it seems that there seems to be a sense that the production of knowledge and understanding will suffer if and to the extent that the work of different disciplines is kind of partitioned off and segregated. But obviously this kind of cross-disciplinary thing is not easy. So to bring it back to today's seminar, I doubt that anyone on the panel, let alone anyone in this very diverse audience, knows about neuropsychology and musicology and jurisprudence and how to curate an open noise studio and how to play the piano to international standards. So it's a lot to ask of the panel to try and speak their expertise to an audience of non-experts, and it's also a lot to ask of you in the audience to try and bridge the gap between your own fields and those of the panel. But that's the whole point of the series, basically, is to try and create a space in which we can get a little taste of different ways of doing things, basically, even if it's never going to be possible in 90 minutes to understand and enter into that logic completely. Hence the emphasis on informality, basically. So on that note, let me introduce the panel and to thank them and to thank you for being willing to take part in what's essentially a kind of live methodological experiment. So, so to do them in order of alphabetical order, we have Linda Kouvaras. She's a composer, a musicologist, a pianist. In the 80s, she was part of a new wave band called Vox Pop. She's currently... Is that right? Just checking. And she's currently a senior lecturer in musicology at the Melbourne Conservatorium of Music. She's interested in Australian music, postmodernism and gender issues in music, and the title of her recent book, which came out last year with Ashgate, is Loading the Silence, Australian Sound Art in the Post-Digital Age. Then we have Neil McLachlan. He's a composer, an instrument maker, a neuropsychologist. He's actually associate professor at the Melbourne School of Psychological Sciences in its Music and Auditory Neuroscience lab. Yeah? Cool. And so he's thinking about questions such as what are the neurocognitive mechanisms involved in auditory perception, and how can neurocognitive models of hearing inform auditory cultures? Then, yes? Good question. And then we have James Parker, who people at Melbourne Law School will know, and whose brainchild this panel is. James is a legal scholar. He's a lecturer here at Melbourne Law School, and his research looks into the relationship between law and sound. He's also a music critic. He's the host of an experimental music show on PBS, community radio, which is called Farside Virtual. And as I said before, he's the director of IILAH's new Law, Sound in the International Research Programme. And in fact, I should mention that this event is also kind of a warm-up for another larger workshop next year, which is going to be on sonic violence, called Acoustic Justice, Hearings from the Critical South. And last but not least, we have Joel Stern. He's an artist, a composer, a musician. He's a member of a band called Sky Needle, which on your website is described as a primitive rock band playing homemade instruments. We lined up a video, actually, if you want to play it later. He's co-director of Other Film, a collective dedicated to increasing the awareness, appreciation, and accessibility of avant-garde, experimental, abstract, expanded, and other audiovisual art to Australian audiences. He's curator of Disembraining Machine, a monthly open noise studio, among other things, and he's also associate lecturer in music at Queensland University of Technology. So welcome to you all, and I'm going to shut up now and hand over. Each of our panelists, just so we know what's going to happen, is going to get 10 minutes. I've got to be a bit strict about this, unfortunately. 10 minutes, I'll give you a 2-minute warning, to give a kind of just an informal introduction to how they're doing what they do and why they're doing it that way. And this, I'm sure, is going to raise all kinds of issues, methodological questions, which I hope the panelists are going to be willing to talk to each other about. And then once they've kind of hashed out their methodological similarities and differences in terms of politics, ethics, aesthetics, and whatever else comes up, I'm going to open up the floor to questions. So please do store questions up in your head as it's going along, and don't feel intimidated if you don't do anything to do with sound, because, like I said before, that's the whole point. So the order is going to be James first. Okay, in order of sitting down. So James, thank you.
Thanks, Rose. Let me also say thank you to IILAH for hosting this in law school, and to Vesna, who's a crucial member of the team and has done a lot of important work today. And thank you also to all of you for coming. It's a bit of a risk doing something like this, and so it's satisfying to know that people are interested enough to turn up. Let me try and explain what I'm doing. So, methodologically, I tend to think of my work as involving two opposing movements, in a way, between law and sound, or rather actually between jurisprudence and what is increasingly getting referred to as sound studies. What is sound studies? Jonathan Stern, one of the key figures, calls it the interdisciplinary ferment in the human sciences that takes sound as its analytical point of departure or arrival. So this event is in a way an event in sound studies, although I do think one interesting question with sound studies is what is sound, and should we actually be orienting ourselves around sound, or should it be something else? But nevertheless, two movements sort of in relation to my work. The first of these movements I tend to, it's between jurisprudence and sound studies, is a kind of drawing in, right? Drawing in towards law, or even an appropriation from this newly emergent interdisciplinary ferment. So in my work, I try to bring certain languages or techniques or ways of thinking or listening to sound or about sound to bear on legal institutions and legal problems and that sort of thing. So to give one example of what I mean by that, one of the questions I've been really interested in my research is, for example, what happens if we think of the courtroom, here's a courtroom, as a soundscape, right? You'll notice the microphones. People wear headphones. There's a sonically, acoustically separated glass window here, which divides the room into different spaces. So, what's going on there? I'm interested in asking. What does it mean to sing your final statement, which is what this guy Simon McKenzie did at his trial, where he was accused of inciting genocide with his songs? He sang his final statement. How is that performance different from other musical performances in the trial setting? How is singing your final statement different from any other kind of oral or oral performance at a trial? How is it stage managed differently, and with what consequences? And so in order to attempt to answer these kinds of questions, lots of other questions too, I sort of draw on, architectural acoustics or sociomusicology or sonic ethnography or whatever, a whole range of different disciplines. So those questions relate to what I would call, here's the judge delivering her, the reading of the judgment, right? It has to be oralized. So here's another kind of acoustic performance at a trial. So these kinds of questions relate to what I would call the judicial soundscape. But we might also think about what sound studies might have to say about law or about legal institutions and their sonic imagination, what I call their sonic imagination. In other words, what I'm interested in here is what would happen if we try to think about, say, the musicology or the theory or even the ideology of sound that's either explicit or more often implicit in legal judgment and practices of legal judgment. How is it that legal institutions conceive of sound, right, even if they aren't overtly conceiving it or they don't know that they're doing it? And I guess the strong version of my claim here actually would be that legal institutions are always thinking about sound in a certain kind of a way, even, or maybe even especially if they don't know that they're doing it. Again, an example might be useful. So from this guy's trial again, Simon McKenzie's trial. So he's accused of inciting genocide with his songs. And two things are really quite obvious from the tribunal's dealings with these songs as far as musicology is concerned. So the first is that the court actually wasn't interested in questions of musicology at all, even to the extent that its approach was virtually anti-musicological. Like, it wanted to exclude at every level questions of music from its determination of the question, what do these songs mean and what do they do? And then, insofar as it didn't do that, when it did draw on musicological claims or implicit ones, it tended to revert to these classic tropes of sort of the Western romantic tradition that I think Linda is going to be interested in engaging with too. So it didn't really pay attention to music, but when it did, it didn't do it very well, and it tended to draw on cliches, essentially. So in summary, this sort of first movement involves me reaching out and pilfering liberally, frankly, from a whole range of disciplines, and the idea is to alert those within the field of law that these questions are important. What's the normative point here? Well, it's that, sound matters more than jurists tend to think they do, essentially. That legal scholarship suffers from a kind of deafness, and that for me that's a kind of ethical failure, actually. So if you were to translate this into a kind of imperative, it would be, listen, or listen better. I realize that might not sound very controversial to those of you who work in sound or musicology or acoustics or whatever, but in law that's a reasonably controversial thing to say. So actually you could think of this event as a performance of this idea, a performative exemplification of this first movement, a drawing into the law faculty of people rather than ideas, or both. Do I feel guilty about this, this kind of profligacy? Yes, I do a little bit. But I hope that in its profligacy, it's kind of productive in a certain kind of way as well, or even important or necessary. And also, I'd say that I tend to think of jurisprudence itself as a discipline as always involving this kind of gesture anyway. That it's always reaching outside of itself, even though it does have a certain kind of particularity. And that's actually the second movement. Despite thinking of myself as doing interdisciplinary work, in a way, I do think of myself first and foremost as a jurist, as somebody who does jurisprudence, which is to say, a kind of a practice of thinking through or caring about legal technique and how law is practiced and produced. The reason I think of myself like that is that if you try to think about questions of law in relation to sound, you inevitably come up against certain problems that other disciplines aren't. I mean, maybe it's not that they're not capable of answering those questions, but they're not very interested in, or it's not their central focus to think about those questions. They can help think about those questions, but it's not their main focus. So to give another example from the McKenzie case, the tribunal ignores the sonority and the musicality of McKenzie's songs. Okay, it says the fact that it's a song. This is the counsel for the prosecution at the trial. The fact that it's a song is not the point. They're openly talking about killing the Tutsi, and when I say openly talking about it, they sang about it too. And simply a means of communicating that direction, whether it's a song or a speech or a written pamphlet, is not the point. So there's this. I think, in my work, I try to argue this is partly a result of legal doctrine. And a substantive focus there on content, ideas, right? Expression, ideas, information, and opinions. And what this leads to, I'd suggest, is a failure to even think about, at the level of doctrine, those aspects of song or music that simply aren't cognizable on that, according to that register of ideas and opinions, right? Whether you could call it a lot of things. You might talk about the ineffability or the excessive quality or the affective qualities of song. I do have an excerpt from one of McKenzie's songs that was supposed to be embedded here, but technology is such that it's hard. It's the little one on the right. So this is one of McKenzie's songs. Just press play. So there's obviously something about that isn't captured by the language of information or opinion, right? Obviously to me. And that's totally missed by the judgment, and partly by virtue of the doctrine it uses. And one way of responding to that would be to say, well, perhaps musicology or neuropsychology or whatever can offer a better reading of this than the court did in its naivety, right? And I get asked this all the time at conferences, or actually in lots of contexts. What did the songs mean? Did they really incite genocide? People ask me. And the problem with that question is that you quickly confront another problem, right? Which is by virtue of which method or discipline or technique or combination of disciplines or techniques should you answer that question? Should it be musicology or neuroscience? And in fact, should it be which brand of musicology, which brand of neuroscience? In law, these questions are answered normally by means of the laws of evidence and expertise. Now that's one way of resolving the dispute, but I actually think there's a more fundamental problem, which is that the disciplines of musicology, neuroscience are, although they are engaged in questions of judgment, are engaged in they're engaged in that question in a slightly different way to the way in which legal institutions are engaged in them. So in musicology, in neuroscience, in art, judgment, I realize this is a bit of an oversimplification, but there's a certain sense in which judgment is always provisional, right? A neuroscientist is or ought always to be happy to be proven wrong, right? When a musicologist talks about the ineffability of music, they don't necessarily mean that there's nothing that you can say about music, but that you could go on saying things about it forever. This is a really nice quotation from a guy called Vladimir Yankelevich. Says, there are infinite and interminable things to be said about music, not zero. And in law, the problem is that judgment can never be provisional. its temporality or its sense of urgency is importantly different. And this is it's put really nicely by Derrida when he says that justice is that which must not wait, right? Justice demands a kind of a cut. Legal judgment needs to be actionable. I'm nearly done. It needs to be actionable and its consequences immediate and violent in a way that makes it fundamentally different as a form of judgment to other disciplines. And moreover, this isn't necessarily a failure. We don't have to think of this as a failure. It's fundamental to what law is in a certain way. Even though I realize that there is an extent to which this basic distinction can be broken down when you push it to its limits. Nevertheless, I think there's something important there. And I do think that as a result, jurisprudence, which is concerned with thinking through the techniques of that form of judgment, does have something to say back to sound studies and the other disciplines. So this is the movement outwards in my work.
Thanks, James. Thanks for inviting me along today, and thanks all to you for being here. It's an honour for me and a real treat to be on this floor and see how the other half live, coming from the music department. I just wanted to pick up on, to start my discussion off, I'll pick up on one of the points that James raised then, and that was about the ineffability of music. And traditionally, we're brought up in music study to revere music's ineffability. And I'm all about effing music, to put it ungrammatically. So how did that come about? So traditional musicology would seek to get us all to go right into the musical object and, of course, understand its workings on its own terms, its formalist properties, so we get to work out what chord is this, is it functional, does it have an understood canonic relationship to another chord, what is the overall structure, can we locate the foreground, middle ground, background or oeuvre structures. So it's very much all about the medium of the artwork itself. Or you're allowed to, if you don't like to get your hands dirty too much by revelling around in actual musical scores, you're allowed to go off and do watermark investigation and archival research in important European locked-away libraries and discover that Beethoven actually wrote this particular sketch on the 14th of July instead of the 11th, and someone's grandmother has the 14th sonata under her bed, and it gets discovered when she's dead that Beethoven gave to her great-grandmother or whatever. Yeah, so in other words, it's quantifiable, empirical, concrete facts that we're traditionally encouraged to restrict ourselves in our musicological engagement, and as performers we'll look at understood authentic performance practice ideas about how to play forte loud in Beethoven as opposed to Rachmaninoff, as opposed to Boulez, as opposed to Bach. And is it actually okay to play Bach on the piano, the modern piano, because Bach didn't have the piano that we have today, and when he saw the early prototype of it, it wasn't as good as what we've got today, and he didn't like it very much. So therefore, is it really bad and immoral of us to actually play our preludes and fugues, etc., on the piano? I've had lots of arguments about that with authentic performance scholars, but I won't go into those now. So another thing about traditional music study was that it only revered elitist music that you really only understood if you were kind of brought up in the tradition, and if you heard popular music and as a serious music student liked it, it was a guilty pleasure. And it certainly never featured on any undergraduate subjects that I took. neither did any music by women. I can remember asking my tutor in first year for Renaissance and Baroque music, what about some female composers? And he said there weren't any, but that's only because he didn't know any better. Anyway, you know, a whole 4-year degree that I did, no music by women at all. So I thought after I did masters in piano that that'd be it. For me and music study. I loved learning about chords and everything, but it didn't really explain to me the juice of what I loved about music. And then I chanced upon a book called Feminine Endings, and it was a 1989 sort of explosion, no, I think 1991, sorry, book that exploded feminist musicology. There'd been a few rumblings in the 80s. Joseph Kerman, a literary, asked for musicologists to delve into approaches from literary criticism to look into what music means with a capital M, not just how it was composed, who composed it, when, where, or etc., etc., etc. Anyway, in Feminine Endings, Susan McLachlan talks about being wanting to do feminist musicology and feeling like Judith, I think, in Blackbeard's castle, and opening all these forbidden doors and what would happen to her. And sure enough, she's been vilified and torn apart and then put back together again by the music institutions. Anyway, what really sort of grabbed my attention first was her discussion of the way music, even in its supposed ineffability, has been a gendered thing. So we actually have had up until about 1980s, when dictionaries stopped using these terms, feminine and masculine cadences. And a feminine cadence, this is in dictionaries, including the Harvard Dictionary of 1970-something, a feminine cadence is a cadence that finishes off, so a cadence is like a musical punctuation point. You feel a sense of arrival or closure when you have a cadence, and a cadence needs 2 chords to produce that sort of sense. And a feminine cadence is a cadence that falls on the, guess which beat? The strong or the weak. And a very prominent musical theorist had advice for how to remedy Chopin's, often referred to as an effeminate composer, and that's why we can accept him for sort of intimate chamber kind of situations and when we're exploring the inner workings of our tortured souls. But it's also why he couldn't really write symphonies, because they're a proper masculine form. Anyway, to remedy one of his incorrigible, that was the word that was used in the article, feminine cadences in one of his polonaises, a pianist may cleverly use a hemiola, which is a displacement of the normal sense of the beat, into the next bar, forcing that cadence to actually feel like a strong cadence, and then all is right with the world. And so I thought, well, there's something very interesting going on here. Anyway, so that opened up the idea of further study for me and PhD work and so on, and here I am. And at the same time, we also hardly studied any Australian music, and I thought, oh, this is not good. And so I thought, well, what's out there? Gosh, so much. And that's when I discovered sound art, and that, just to reorient back to the discussion here, so that background is sort of all about looking inwards, looking outwards, and trying to work out why music might move us, what music might mean for different societies, what does it say about one of the fundamental issues that we all encounter and all are informed by in the world, namely gender. So, but my book, Loading the silence in the title is referring to one of the most significant composers of the 20th century, John Cage, and his 4 minutes 33 seconds in brackets silence or tacit, meaning don't play. So if there was an interesting law case that some of you might have heard about the other year, just fairly recently. Anyway, the piece is 4 minutes and 33 of silence. So if you want to play it, inverted commas, you get the score, that is blank. It just says movement 1, movement 2, movement 3, and there are specified time durations for those movements. And you put the score on the piano, you close the lid, and you sit there for the required numbers of minutes and turn the pages when you should, and you leave the stage. And of course there was a riot at the first performance. People wanted their money back, etc., etc. People very confused, traumatised, and or the rest. And but Cage's whole point was, let's not be hierarchical about music. Let's not be elitist about music. Why should music only be about this and only have those instruments playing it? Let's have the world coming in. Let's listen to sounds and love them all. Now, his enterprise was incredibly important and galvanising, and led to, were associated with a lot of happenings in the 60s and performance artworks. And another one of his compositions is called 0 minutes and 0 seconds, and it involves him drinking a glass of orange juice into a microphone. So it's all about attending to sound and celebrating it. Now, I see that as the kind of end point of a modernist exploration in looking at the intensity of the medium itself, because he's all about sound, 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 sound. Look, sound is all around us. So he's saying, go out into the world and hear sound. Don't just keep it cloistered in the ivory towers. But there was very much a determined non-specificity about how to listen and what you are listening to, what it might mean. I see postmodern sound artists coming along to load that silence with specifics about the world, about the art of listening, about the practice of hearing, about the art of making artworks that in themselves ask you to do all of these things, and reflecting on the world in a very kind of defined way. Not necessarily sort of saying this is, but just attend to what's going on here and then do something in your own way about it. So I wanted to bring us now to a concrete example of something that I'm looking at, and that's Julia Gillard's so-called misogyny speech from last year. And just as a little bit more background, how much more time have I got, Rose?
It's pretty much over.
Oh, she was sorry. Okay, yes. I really liked one of James's points, just very quickly, and just to talk about one of the sound artists that I look at in my book, and he's talking about extreme sort of performance situations involving sound, and one of the groups around town that was active a while ago, and I'm not sure if they still are anyway, was called Random Acts of Elevator Music, where they would sort of take over a guerrilla style, but very gently, elevators in the CBD with their portable music instruments, having dressed up as business people with briefcases holding instruments, and burst into songs in the elevators. Just to charge that scene with interconnectivity through sound. You can't help but smile and look at each other in a crowded lift if music is suddenly being produced out of briefcases. Anyway, so this speech, Julia Gillard's speech. Now, okay, so she's making the speech with a voice, we can hear it. I am interested in the way women's voice is received as just a sort of social phenomenon. If we think of Lindy Chamberlain and the way she was really punished for having an affectless voice. Her voice wasn't performing as a proper woman's emotionally should when she's lost her baby. Things like that. Gillard was often criticised, well, for pretty much everything, you know, from her clothes to even Germaine Greer. I couldn't believe Germaine Greer, oh dear, on that note. Anyway, her voice has been made a lot of, much more so, I would suggest, than has horrible voiced male politicians. Okay, Julia might not have the most mellifluous voice or accent, but gee, so much nasty things said. So here we have a composer that was moved not only by Gillard's speech but by the reception that it got. And his name is Robert Davidson, he works in Queensland, and he wanted to do a musical work that presented some empathy for this person who was being so derided by so many people in her own country, not so much overseas. And this is the result of what he has done.
And is it all right if we give it a minute? Will that do?
Oh, yeah, not the whole thing. Yeah,
okay,
sure,
cool.
yeah.
And then
yeah.
we'll move on and maybe we can talk about it in the
Absolutely, yeah, sure thing. Yeah.
It comes in.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call for amendments.
Thank you very much, Deputy Speaker, and I rise to oppose the motion moved by the Leader of the Opposition. And in so doing, I say to the Leader of the Opposition, I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. I will not. And I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny by this man. Not now, not ever. The Leader of the Opposition says that people who hold sexist views and who are misogynists are not appropriate for high office. Well, I hope the Leader of the Opposition has got a piece of paper and he is writing out his resignation. Because if he wants to know what misogyny looks like in modern Australia, he doesn't need a motion in the House of Representatives.
You have to put it back on the slides for Neil.
Okay, that's a hard act to follow. I've just been listening. I thought I could say I'm here because when I was doing my PhD in physics, I discovered John Cage and the University Theatre Company, and I launched. By the time I'd finished writing up, I had my first Australia Council grant to work as a composer and a dancer in a theatre company in Melbourne. So I just kept going, and but what I did was I tried to apply my physics to sound, because I was outside of the genre of classical music. I didn't have a grammar, didn't have a theory of music to go by. But and what was fairly established at the time was the realms of psychoacoustics and acoustics, physics-based disciplines, and even our understanding of pitch began with Galileo counting a string going up and down, and said, oh well, pitch is the number of cycles per second. And then Helmholtz started cutting up ears and discovered the membrane inside the ear, the cochlea. So oh, it's the membrane. Then they discovered the auditory nerve and said, oh no, then we had computer algorithms for pitch. And to this date, pitch is still not explained. So in my own trajectory, I started using physics because that's what the milieu at the time, that's how we describe sound, as physics. And I'm going to try and convince you today that in fact music has very little to do with physics. It's a long journey I've been on, and I've in fact, having worked I designed the Federation bells using computational modelling and a lot of physics, and then having made the bells, wanted to publish about it, and said, well, how do I know what people are hearing? How do I know if this bell, designed according to these rules of physics and psychoacoustics, is perceptible in the way I think it is? So I wrote a grant to work in psychology, and I've been there since 2006 doing music and auditory neuroscience. And what I want to talk about, what I've come to now in the work we're just publishing at the moment, is really the question is this a good sound or a bad sound? You know? And that's what I'm trying to answer. And the reason that's important is that all of us say we love music, pretty much, nearly almost all of us. But the biggest problem that a local government, the City of Melbourne, faces is noise complaints. Noise annoyance is one of the greatest problems that face an industrialised city. So music or sound creates feeling. And feeling is primitive, evolutionary, ancient part of the brain. And we like to think of music as being a highly cultured high art. Hopefully I can convince you that it's the very primitive parts of the brain that we're engaging when we're listening to sound and making the motivations. Why do we bother doing things? It's because it makes us feel good or bad. We respond to the world through feeling, not through thought. Rationality, as we all know, people don't behave rationally. So let's have a quick, I'm going to give a Cook's tour of the brain. The primitive brain is so I've got some, I'm going to talk a bit about the brain stem, which is the pons medulla, literally right on top of the brain, the spine. The cerebellum, which is an equally ancient part of the brain. And above that, we've got the central part, which is the limbic system, which is where most of the mammalian emotional processing goes on. And on top of that is the modern neocortex, which is the primate's brain, and finally the human brain. And if we can look at it this way, the reptilian brain really just has the cerebellum and the brainstem. And then the limbic system, because mammals had to nurture their babies, started to produce dopamine and hormones, and that's in the limbic system, the old mammalian, and the neo-primate brain sits on top of that. And if we switch it around looking straight on, inside the blue circle is the reptilian brain, and this is the auditory pathway. So here's the auditory nerve. We've got a couple of ancient processing parts, thalamus, and then on top of that out to the primary auditory cortex, which is where most of the psychologists will tell you we do all our higher processing of sound. But of course, it really can't be like that, because reptiles and rodents and stuff get on quite well in the world, and they don't have a neocortex. So it's informative to think about, well, what can these creatures do? And this is the top right is to scale. That's a rat's brain. that's a human brain cut through the middle. And if we scale up this rat's brain, we can see it's got a big cerebellum, and it's got a big brain stem, and the thalamus, and that limbic system and thalamus, where it has its emotional responses, and a big olfactory bulb, the blue thing at the front, that's the smell. That's actually in the front of our brain where we process smell, and a little cerebral cortex, because smell regulates a lot of the rat's behaviour. And the auditory pathways are in the pons. So without a cerebrum, I'll cut to the chase. I'm proposing that it's the pons and the cerebellum that's doing a lot of auditory processing, which is what you will not find in a textbook. In fact, the cerebellum has been relegated to being this gate, how we move, as a motion control. But let's think about what can these primitive animals do? They can recognise sounds, and one of the big changes we've introduced to neuroscience, auditory neuroscience, is the idea that the first thing an auditory system has to do is recognise sound, because that's the first thing an animal, is it predator or is it prey? And that's the first thing that would have evolved, and it's the first decision any animal makes when they first hear a sound. So environmental sounds, conspecific alarm calls, and security and mating calls, and so on. And they'll respond to those sounds with startle or conditioned reflexes. Pavlov's dog, you ring a bell and it starts to salivate. This rat will either learn to fear the sound of the buzzer because it's going to get an electric shock, or if the buzzer goes off and nothing happens, he will habituate and learn to ignore the buzzer. Or you can play with it like an oncologist might and do things to its head. The great thing, these are marine iguanas in the Galapagos Islands. Incredibly, they don't have vocal communication, and they've just got that tiny reptile brain. They have learnt, out of all the songs that the mockingbirds can sing, they have learnt the mockingbird song for hawk. And when they hear this song, they obviously get emotionally aroused, and they jump in the water and run and swim away. So here is an animal without a cerebral cortex that can learn a song and have an emotional response to that song. So I'd like to say we're not that special. I think he's a pretty cool dude, actually. So there's your autonomic arousal, adrenaline, and fear. Of course, we all know what happens when the male frog... 2 minutes. We all know what happens when a male frog gets his song right. There's the dopamine system. And there's nothing like a cat purring to get oxytocin going. So that's the nurturing hormone. So music plays on all these hormones. I'm getting some real serious stuff now. I'll jump this slide, but basically, here's the frontal, this is a rat's brain, this is the frontal bit, and this is limbic system here. This is the important thing, the nucleus accumbens. And the nucleus accumbens, what's amazing about it, if you electrically stimulate one side of the nucleus accumbens, you'll get a pleasure response. If you electrically stimulate the other side, you'll get a pain response to the same stimulus. And in fact, there's the fine line between pleasure and pain. and the nucleus accumbens, this explains an enormous amount of behaviour. The nucleus accumbens is this activation of the nucleus, it's modulated by the prefrontal cortex. So if there's a sound that you've learnt to like, it will activate nucleus accumbens to produce dopamine and pleasure, or adrenaline and fear. And it's cultured, it's acculturated, it's learnt behaviour. Now, I can't possibly go through all, I'll jump through this quickly. So, this is our new model of the auditory system. This is what you'll see in the textbooks. These basic that I showed you in the first slide. This is all the new stuff, which is the cerebellum and the pons and the brainstem and all those things that reptiles and rodents have. And we've already, it's well documented from the neurophysiology that the startle reflex passes through this pons out to the motor output in about 5 milliseconds. It's just a couple of synapses. It has to be fast. Autonomic arousal, so that next thing that happens is a heartbeat racing and fear. That takes a little bit longer, 20 milliseconds, and we can see that's well known to go through this brain stem and into the thalamus and amygdala. And then from there to the frontal cortex, where primates and humans can label it or associate that sound. So someone walks in here, fires a gun. What happens? We all duck. It happens 5 milliseconds, we're ducked. Then our hearts beat race, we look at each other and go, was that a gun? Right? 5, 20, 50 milliseconds, that's the pathway. So from this we can begin to understand, why we have these responses to sound. And if we can identify a sound in the frontal cortex, we can decide which way we're going to develop, the nucleus accumbens, which side it's going to fall on. Are we going to have a pleasure response? So if it's a violin, or if someone walks in with the bagpipes, we may all have a horror response from fear. So that's if we can recognise the sound. But if we fail, there's one other little thing here. It's the cerebellum that processes through time. So that's the sounds are spectral and temporal, and the cerebellum does the temporal processing. And auditory imagination. If I say a car door, it's the long-term memory is in the brainstem, and because it's associated with the frontal cortex, you can top down cause that memory to be played out through the pons and then back up into your cortex as if you were hearing it. So that's how the auditory imagination and how priming and segregation of sound works. We can control what we think we're going to hear. So what does this mean for music? Well, gamelan, which is Indonesian music, is played on gongs and keyed instruments and strange timbres, and the physics, if you read any textbook on pitch, they can't possibly have pitch. It's the elephant in the room for the last 100 years of music psychology. And so we tested it because I'm a scientist. And on the left you see the Western trained musicians, and on the right, and that's the variance in their pitch judgment. So of course the people who have learnt gamelan can pitch gamelan instruments. That paper was knocked back from the 2 leading journals in the field, the Journal of Acoustic Society of America and the Journal of Experimental Psychology, on racist grounds. The reviewers said it's not possible for gamelan to have pitch, and that's the end of it. It took us 3 goes to get that paper up. These are just showing you, we do the fMRI studies and we can point out the nucleus accumbens and all those other things here. And of course now, the last thing about emotion and music is if we can't recognise the sound, you know, that bump in the night, you know, fear, and dissonance. What we've shown in one of our latest papers is that dissonance is when you hear a chord that you can't recognise, or a melody that doesn't fit with your grammar that you've been acculturated to. And as we train people to certain chords, so the grey ones are their pitch matching improving, and they learn to pitch match certain chords, and the black ones is their dissonance response changing. So as they learn the chords, they become familiar and their dissonance drops. But the ones they haven't learnt, the dissonance doesn't change. So, you know, dissonance has got nothing to do with physics, it's got nothing to do with harmonics, and anything that you've ever read in a textbook about music is wrong, because it's come from Western canon, and it's been sort of propagating itself. They've only been studying Western music, and lo and behold, everyone who's been trained on Western music behaves the way they thought they would. It's a circular argument. So this is important. So what does this give us about, how does this change our ideas about auditory culture? Well, emotional responses are learnt, musical responses are learnt, all music is acculturated, and anyone can learn music. When we're confronted with new sounds, our personality has a big effect, whether we're open to new experiences or we find them fearful, and different personalities will respond differently on that ground. And you can actually learn a new timbre in an electronic music piece, postmodern work, during the music. And electronic composers actually work with the evolving memory and understanding for what people are hearing in real time. And so we're getting to the point now that we can come up with a theory of music which is acultural, across all cultures and across traditions. Because at the moment, music theory, as we were just hearing about, is being locked into this circular Western canon. Okay. Sorry, it's a very...
Me? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks for having me. This has already been incredibly instructive for me. I just want to say to Linda, about 10 years ago, I was in India and I bought a little electronic music box that creates a kind of drone sound, and it has a knob on it, and at one end it says male and the other end female, and I never understood what that meant, and I sort of spent a long time kind of twiddling that knob, trying to work out that it was obviously something to do with the cadences and the strength or weaknesses of them. And also to Neil, I'm curating a festival at the end of the year called The Ear is a Brain. So very interesting to hear what you were saying. So I'm going to refer to notes, and that's sort of more for your benefit than mine, because I have a tendency to forget what I plan to say. I'll come at this more from the angle of curatorial practice around sound art, or sound as art, and give two examples that have different kind of methodologies associated with them. The first one is a project called the Instrument Builders Project. It's a project that has already happened twice. It's had 2 iterations. It involves 8 artists, 4 from Australia and 4 from Indonesia, who come from a range of disciplines and get together for 1 month in a shared sort of workshop warehouse studio space in Yogyakarta in Java, in Indonesia. And the space is both a workshop for creating and making, as well as an exhibition space for public engagement with the kind of idea of creating and making. So the instrument as a sort of rubric is at the centre of this project, and questions like what is an instrument, what could be an instrument, how could something that is not an instrument be instrumentalised, are the sort of core questions of the project. If we start with the musical instrument, but then sort of extend this idea into other kinds of instruments, scientific, medical, social, and sort of philosophical ideas of the instrument, is this a way to bring music into relation with other disciplines? So that's sort of one of the approaches. Another question is, how does this project play out in the context of Yogyakarta, the local sort of situation there, and in the context of Australian and Indonesian collaboration, and all of the assumptions that the artists from both countries bring to that. Maybe what I want to suggest is that the curatorial methodology of this project is that the curatorial methodology instrumentalises in order to think through these various questions. So I just want to give an example of something that happened in April when we ran the last project in Yogyakarta. One of the Australian artists was quite sort of confronted by the extent to which the Indonesian artists employ art assistants, outsource labour to workshops, use industrial production, and there was quite a sort of a common methodology there, much more so than here for artists at a particular level. Of course, senior artists everywhere kind of do these things. But the Australian artist was contrasting this with his own DIY or do-it-yourself approach, where there's a kind of radical autonomy in taking individual control over the production of the work. And one of the Indonesian artists responded by saying that his philosophy is DIWO, do it with others. And that this approach integrates the artist into sort of these shifting and provisional communities of workers across a number of fields, and makes it clear that the artist contributes, takes part in communities rather than always trying to find an autonomous space, which might be more like the space posited by experimental music in a place like Melbourne. And, you know, perhaps that space doesn't really exist anyway. So this is a kind of political conversation, but in this project, I think it functioned as a kind of thinking through sound. The sonic practices which acted as a generator for this dialogue, the possibility that connecting different practices, skills and ideas through the rubric of an instrument, that these connections could be thought of sort of almost like dots on a graphic score as different points which have a compositional logic, and the implication of harmony or dissonance in these different conceptions of the relationship between music and other disciplines. So that's one example. The other example I want to talk about is the Liquid Architecture Festival, which is a national festival of sound art. Well, it originally was of experimental music, but it kind of rebranded as being as addressing sound as an art form in the early 2000s. And I've come in as artistic director this year, and I'm kind of thinking about how to address this idea of sound as an art form and how to distinguish it from other practices like experimental and avant-garde music. So for this year's Liquid Architecture, we're focusing on artists who work at the threshold of language and signification. So practices that slip between different modes of conveying meaning. And in coming up with this idea, we kind of imagine a work. So in a lecture, we're listening intently to the speaker, trying to understand the meaning of what they say. We're listening semantically to the code of language, but the speaker begins to slur, murmur, and stutter, becoming increasingly unintelligible. So the listener is now sort of struggling as the flow of language becomes distorted, but gradually the listener realises they're hearing something else, the physicality of mouth movements, and what the theorist of sound Brandon LaBelle calls micro-oralities, and these also convey a different kind of signification. So I want to focus on this moment where the listener is struggling to understand what they're hearing, where the work holds a mirror up to the listening. And in order to do this, the methodology is to explore the overlap between the lecture and the sound artwork by thinking through some core aspects that the two mediums commonly hold, most notably the production of a very specific listening subject, an audience who listens intently trying to decode the meaning of what they hear. So we could say this sort of panel is a kind of sound artwork, and depending on how hard you're struggling to understand what we're saying, but the struggle is sort of where the art comes into it. So maybe another way of thinking about this curatorial methodology is that it replaces the exhibition or the concert with the lecture as the sort of paradigmatic context for sound art and the site for thinking through sound.
Thanks. Thank you all so much. Yeah, I don't. Do you have questions for each other? Like, how should we do this? We need to. There's so many places we could start. I've been trying to think of the best one, but it would be better to start with you if you have.
I have a question. Because I could have also begun with John Cage if I wanted to, and in fact, in my thesis, which was, you know, I open, as all books on sound do now, with John Cage's epiphany in the anechoic chamber, right? That when there's no sound, he still hears something, and what does he hear? He hears his own organs, and he hears his nervous system, and he hears his breathing. So, the result of Cage is, it's very useful for me, right? Because I'm trying to draw things in, right? So I can say, ha 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 ha, there's always sound, everybody. Didn't you know, lawyers, silly lawyers, in your naivety, that everything is sound, sound is everywhere. And that's a really easy gesture for me to make, right? And it seems that the politics of what we're all implicitly doing it, some more explicitly, is a politics of inclusion, right? So I want to bring sound into the fold. You want to bring, Linda, you know, feminist or non-canonical Western sounds into the fold to open our ears to these. We're trying to open our ears to non-Western sounds or to, you know, the affective or artistic in speech or whatever it is, right? And you know, it just strikes me that that's potentially a different kind of hegemony, and there's something in common with like liberal politics, basically, going on there, which is fine in a way. I'm kind of into inclusion, but it also makes me a little bit uncomfortable that. You know, so I guess I'm wondering actually if orienting ourselves around sound with Cage as our sort of master figure is a problem, or maybe it's not a problem, maybe it's fantastic. But it struck me that was kind of a common thread through all of our presentations.
I think that what you were saying, Linda, about what contemporary artists are now doing is filling in that space that Cage made. And I think that's a really good reply to that, because Cage and the other postmodernists said we need to step away from this canon, this idea of a canon, and you know, we'd pretty much exhausted what you could do with 12-tone music after Schoenberg, and they're looking for new ways. Some went to non-Western music, but it couldn't be reconciled. And Cage sort of said, well, we can think about this from a radically different position. But that left a void. His silence piece left a void. Literally, we couldn't. There was, without a grammar, what can you say? And what I've come to over many years is constructing new grammars, and having this physics, a very scientific. I've got an analytical approach to everything, but I'm trying to synthesize things. So I don't just sit back and analyze. I make a gesture and look at how that operates. And I think a lot of artists are trying to make new grammars. And the inclusive part, what's really important for me is I'm trying to build a new instrument ensemble, a gamelan, but with Western tuning, with Western timbre, so that we can enter into that world. But the gamelan is amazing because it is a social musical. No, you don't, in a gamelan, you don't have you can have virtuosi, but you're not the standout musician. It's a group music process, and it's best imagined as everyone coming together in the evening with their children sitting on their laps and playing music as a meditation, as a group, as a metaphor for the way their community works, and it's a way of bringing people together. And right now in the West, we're down to about 5% of adults making sound, making music, down from probably 50%. And if music evolved, if human brain evolved from our musicality, music was the proto-language, and music, there's a lot of evidence now that music drove the evolution of the human brain. And because it's the intense synchronization. If just like a military drill, if we can synchronize at the level of music in 10 millisecond time domain, we are very powerful as a group.
I'm uncomfortable with the politics that's inserted into the scientific claim there. A little bit uncomfortable with it.
Which politics?
Well,
which claim? Which sorry.
Well, the proximity between your politics and your science are in relation to this question are quite clear, because you want to assert the naturalness of a certain kind of music in order to make a political claim about inclusivity and modes of participation and rejuvenating society by means of music, and it's fine. Again, it's fine, but I get a bit anxious when you're trying to. It seems like you're trying to suggest that ideas of naturalness will found this new politics.
No, it's a completely invented grammar. I'm saying, this is why I'm saying, I'm trying to fill this void with. I'm saying, here is a new way of doing it. Here's a new way of making a score. Here's a new way of creating instruments and actually physically making them. And that's why I say it's a synthetic process where I'm actually making something. I'm not just analysing. I'm not saying that it's a naturalistic. I'm not putting it in that way. It is a cultural product, just like any other musical form. But it's an important cultural product because we've lost our musicality and we need to reinvent it. And so we actually have to we have to actually make that effort. Yeah.
Can I say some things about Cage, because that sort of brought up a few ideas. Because I'm not sure if he created a void in a way, because in this field Cage is the canon, and from a
he is now. He wasn't
now.
But even from an art historical perspective, like a recent book like Craig Dworkin's book No Medium, which looks at the history of blank or sort of silent artworks, you can sort of see that Cage comes after Rauschenberg's white paintings, and that there's a sort of whole formalist tradition of focusing in on medium to the extent that you kind of remove all content. Philip Brophy wrote a couple of years ago that Cage composed as if in his own anechoic chamber, which sort of excluded all of the social implications of his work.
Exactly.
So if you want to talk about Cage and politics, there's a lot of problems there, because that dictum of let sounds be themselves is often to the exclusion of all of these implications around, the politics of listening. And his own anarchism sort of didn't, in a way, bring him to make any kind of political, to really deal with those political implications. But Douglas Kahn has a great sort of critique of the anechoic chamber story, in which he says there are the two sounds that come from Cage's body, from the nervous system and the blood pumping, but there's also the third sound, which Cage doesn't acknowledge, which is the sound of his own listening, or the synthesizing of the two sounds that is
his internal thinking, because we think in sound. When we actually use language, it's internal. We're using our auditory system.
That's right. So if we kind of follow that through, we can never sort of just let sounds be themselves, because we're thinking them into existence, and then the kind of system in which the listener, is situated. In other words, the sort of politics of the listening is always really relevant.
And this is where it's interesting if you think about noise annoyance, which is just this classic problem. It's hypervigilance that once we associate a sound with something we dislike, and it's about political control. If it's the factory or the nightclub down the road that you're not in control of it, its sound will become really annoying to you, and then you start listening for it.
Like when
Can't help
the
yourself.
Socialist Alternatives took over Q&A the other night, Tony Jones couldn't control them with their sound.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he was very annoyed.
Very.
Yeah.
Tony doesn't like decorum being upset. and sound can really do that.
Should we open up to questions?
Yes, we can do that. James, what do you think? Have you got any other...
Well, can I just ask quickly a question of James? When you said in your address that you felt guilty or uncomfortable or thought that you should, can you just expand on that, please? Just to give me a moral lesson.
Confession.
Well, I feel guilty about what I'm doing all the time.
The point I'm getting at there is there's something extremely rigorous about having a method, or there's an appeal to method, right? And it's about moving towards a foundation to found your work in something that would make it rigorous and meaningful. And I strive for that in a way. I don't mean like a pure foundation, but I want to be able to explicate myself and to say what I do. But on the other hand, I'm also totally irreverent in the way that I treat method in some respects. I literally go through, I mean, if you went into my office, you'd see a whole load of books about sound, and what was my method? I take them off. I look for things that I listen to new pieces of music that actively are doing the critique for me, providing the new ways of listening for me. I go to performance, and the performance alerts me to the politics of a room like this, or so obviously, so for example, the courtroom is not set up like this. A courtroom is designed to facilitate conversation in a certain kind of way, and there's a politics to that. So you can see that when you participate in oral events and and so the point about feeling guilty is that the attempt to found a new method or to draw methods from elsewhere in, whilst acknowledging that you're not competent you don't own them, right? Is a problem. I do feel sometimes a little bit guilty, and then I sort of think, and this is the other point that I was trying to make in that presentation that I rushed a bit in the end, is that, well, if I'm borrowing from everything else, what is it that I have, right? If all I ever do is look outwards, what can I assert? What is it that can I? Because I think maybe this is an anxiety only for lawyers, but I sometimes think that law likes to think of itself as that which is without method, right? So it's like, why bother doing law? And so I would like to try, when I think about method, I try to think about, what is it that my training facilitates me to do that I can use to illuminate something for people who may be interested in the McKenzie case or other things, that my discipline, even though it's open and profligate and so kind of, what is it that can offer back? So it's an anxiety. I hope that wasn't moralizing.
No.
Do you guys feel like you have a similar kind of anxiety, or do you feel more kind of grounded?
Artists shouldn't be anxious.
Yeah. Well, I thought
lawyers shouldn't be anxious,
I don't
but
know.
artists should be anxious.
I'm just saying. I don't know about lawyers, but artists should be.
Well, I thought art was the discipline that asserted that it was sort of art is that which is without method. And so to hear a law scholar say that is quite comforting, actually. But I wonder if
not everyone in this institution might say that.
No, I thought it was a very odd thing to know. I'll let that.
I wonder sometimes whether art is sort of methodologically a kind of privileged space, just because the method and then the methodology and then the sort of thing that is created out of that are kind of in this feedback sort of loop where, and in a way, the methodology becomes a sort of an aesthetic object too, especially with a lot of contemporary art that doesn't necessarily produce an aesthetic experience but just illuminates a methodology. So in that sense, I don't know if we're collectively ruining methodology or kind of elevating it to the level of art.
It's funny, I still think of myself as an artist who works in numbers.
That's your medium.
Yeah.
But yeah, what my musicological approach is sort of described as the new musicology or critical musicology. The new musicology was new in the 90s when it sort of came about, so it's an unfortunate term. Yeah, so critical musicology is a sort of similar term. New musicology really originated in America and is all about letting popular music into the ivory tower, and critical musicology can be applied, it's sort of new magpie kind of profligate thinking applied back in time to works like Ravel or Charles Ives or Beethoven or even further back that traditionally weren't thought of in ways such as where's the subjectivity, how is meaning created, etc., etc. And it's interesting with methodology in music, even on traditional terms and on its own terms, it falls down. You guys probably know of Heinrich Schenker and his way of creating an all-encompassing theory of Austro-Germanic music of the canon. So, in other words, from Bach to Beethoven, to Brahms, with Beethoven sort of towering in the middle. And he devised a theory that accounted for all that music composed in that language that proved the supremacy of the Austro-Germanic Empire, because the basic idea of a tonic triad accorded with natural physics properties of the overtone series, because the first three fundamentals are foregrounded in the tonic triad. So therefore, it came from God, so therefore the sort of music that works in his system, which is German music, is the next thing to God. And the trouble is that it doesn't account for everything, even in that music, and certainly not in other music that uses the same tonal language, like Tchaikovsky, but that was Russian, and so it wasn't German, so therefore it was lower down the run. Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is that even if you are rigorous with your method, there's always going to be a something else. There's always going to be some dribble that won't be, contained. There's always going to be a seepage that you can't, dry up nicely.
just on that, quite a horrifying observation was that the fascists in Europe, when they looked at the problem with this theory, Schenkerian theory, was that it was all about harmonics, it's physics. Well, how come music changed from the medieval times to modern times? Why did these new chords become allowable in the musical traditions? And they said, oh, that's because the Aryan superior race has evolved, and there were papers written in the early 20th century just saying that this was the evolution of the master race, as expressed through the evolution of musical harmony in Europe. And it was against that background, there was an amazing woman, American psychologist, who wrote a paper not unlike the work we were doing back in the 1920s, which showed that it was all complete nonsense, it was all learned, and her paper, she was a woman, she was American, was never cited again. It was buried in the literature for 100 years. And before the Second World War, she'd done her whole PhD and a number of major papers pulling the rug out from all that. But it was political, it was purely political. It suited the European, it's a racist position.
I'm gonna get some questions from out there now. Pete, did you have one? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to kind of get